Okay, so our second speaker for the afternoon is Dr. Christine Gailey. I'm pleased to be introducing her today. Dr. Gailey is professor of anthropology. Her research centers on gender hierarchies in the context of state dynamics, viewed comparatively and historically. Dr. Gailey has published on feminist methods in anthropology, on comparative issues of gender in reproductive policies and practices, on gender and colonial state formation, on gender and nationalism, and on community and familial responses to gendered violence. Her latest research focuses on gender, race, and class dynamics in U.S. domestic and international adoption. Several of her anthropological publications focus on the history of critical ethnology. In addition to her scholarly writing, Professor Gailey is a published ethnopoet. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Christine Gailey.
Thank you, Joshua Lieto, soon to be Dr. Lieto. Okay. Yeah. I need timing. Okay. When you graduated from the Fidel Castro School of Oratory, you need somebody to time you and cut you off. Okay. I'm experimenting today because I love Tom so much. You know, he's a comrade. He's a 30 to 35-year-old friend. He's my brother. He's my daughter's uncle. You know, he's just a mensch, okay, as we say. And we've had a conversation with our colleagues and friends and family for that length of time around what emancipation means, what struggle means, what being a scholar in a state institution that cares about human emancipation means. And he's a very loving person, and he's also an incredibly smart guy. And I've had the absolute joy of writing a couple of things with him, and also, it keeps doing that. It's the problem with rabbits. I keep jumping in, you know, and I offer this partially for everybody and partially to sort of continue a discussion that we've had, Tom and me, around what the heck happens to primitive communism. Okay? And when I say primitive communism, I'm saying it unashamedly. The sense of the term is not a colonialist sense. It never was. It meant to indicate temporal depth, that this is a really abiding way of living. It meant original. It meant it didn't imply one way of living. It implied a variety of ways of living in non-exploitative circumstances. And it is in that sense, the deeper Marxian sense, that I'm doing this piece today. But because, you know, I live in everyday life. I'm a feminist. I'm a mom. You know, I love my students. I'm one of those annoying professors who's very nurturing and makes everybody else feel like they're being beastly to their students. And because of that, you know, it's not necessarily the kind of presentation that I would usually give. You're a special audience to me. You know, you're the audience in the place that I came on purpose because of what you represent and because of my gratitude for being included in your world. So, Tom, you understand that. Wendy, you understand that. You all understand it. We're all here for that reason. And so it's for this that I offer what I hope is a gift. I mean, you may say, ooh, puke, I'd rather have a sweater. But, you know, but one can only do what one can do, okay? This is what I can do. I'm going to start off with a part of a poem by our friend who's deceased, Stanley Diamond. And Stanley was my dad. You know, he had nothing to do with blood, and he didn't become my father until I was done with my dissertation, because that would have been incestuous and weird. Okay, so, but for 15 years he was my father, and I loved his poetry. I hope someday to be able to write as wonderfully as he did, where literally the words jump off the page and grab you. And so I'm going to start off with a little segment of a poem that he wrote called Return to the River. His narrative poetry is a marvel. And what he did was to write a poem about the deep history and contemporary struggles around the Hudson River and the location and its denizens, four-footeds, two-footeds, those with wings, those without. And so this segment is one of the ones that I really love the most, and it starts off, he was once criticized for ventriloquizing a Muslim woman, and he said, look, poets ventriloquize, it's what we do. You know, you try to be informed, you try to get at what you think is the deep sensibility of that being, whatever the being is. He said, but I also have ventriloquized otters, you know, really. It's like, I'm a poet. What do you want me to do? You know, it is something where you're trying to get at something larger than the stupid hierarchies that are around you. And that's why Plato would have killed the poets first. Okay? And it's because they're hard to contain. And there were many people who wanted to kill Stanley anyway, but it's like this was, including me from time to time. But this one starts off. Turtle is speaking. They should have known that the tribes will appear, disappear, appear, like the elusive spirits of their uncles, like flecks of foam on the roiled river. But if you want a thing to last forever, name it. Name it twice. Bring it in. So if you want to look at it, the book is called Going West. Thomas C. Patterson has had a 30-year conversation with me and many others about articulating modes of production. Now, immediately all the undergraduates go to sleep. Okay, right? Oh, God, you know, okay. About modes of production, state formation, the collapse of states and what happens in their wake, cultural resistance to state formation, to capitalism, and so on. We live in a world that is lived in opposition. It's lived affirming a different way of being. And we try to learn from the peoples around us who have lived in opposition to these forms of exploitation for many, many centuries. So, you know, the Hopi have taught me much, not as much as I need to know, but if you listen, you can hear it. You can learn. We're educable, even in capitalism. The coterie of anthropologists and historians and psychologists joining this discussion and the attendant forms of activism have carved out an international space of culturally embedded Marxism that also is feminist in practice and approach, anti-racist, and focused on social justice engagement. I want to examine one of our ongoing explorations of primitive communism. Okay, so don't pillory me as a colonialist, Orientalist projection. It's not true. One of the virtually unexplored dimensions of this mode of production, which has been pilloried from the late 1800s on, as either a remnant, passé, a romantic projection, it never really existed, et cetera, et cetera. Whenever something is so roundly criticized, it's worth a second look. Okay, who's criticizing it? Okay. So, and what it is, I mean, one of the things that it is where material resources around you are transformed by people into what are use values, not exchange values. Something that is intended to represent connection. It gets used, so do commodities. But you can't put a price on a use value. It doesn't exist. You can only give it and receive it and deal with the feelings and the connections that are embedded in that transaction. It's not an exchange, it's not a marketplace, it's not any of those things. It's way earlier and deeper and more resonant than any of those things. If you don't think so, think of the last time somebody gave you a really, really deeply felt gift, right? It made you want to cry, or it showed you the love that that person had for you. It cemented the relationship. It's not the thing that does it, but the thing represents, this is the Marcel Mauss moment. The thing sort of embodies the relationship on some level, okay? I don't think it's exactly the how of the gift kind of thing. I don't entirely agree with Mauss. But my argument is that the use values can be gifted or traded in non-monetary sense for others of the same sort of thing. Okay? You give a baby blanket, you get a quilt for your elderly aunt. Okay? It's different. You get something else, or you give something, and it comes back to you in unexpected ways. That's generalized reciprocity in the reductionist sense. You give because it's the right thing to do, and the universe will provide. You don't expect anything in return. It just happens, maybe not. But you know that you should have done it, and you did. Okay, so my argument is that capitalism articulates throughout the world with a lot of modes of production, and people have talked about this endlessly, in colonialism, post-colonial theory, and so on. We're used to looking at traces of their priority and their partial subordinated reproduction. We're used to doing that theoretically. This is one of the things that we do as social science, right? But looking at the transformation of a precious few commodities into non-market use values through a circuit of relationships denies the commodity form, I argue, through time, and provides us with a lens through which we can glimpse a persistent, encapsulated mode of production in capitalism that is our hope. And that, to me, is primitive communism, because it is the only mode of production that does not involve exploitation. Okay? It's variant in its forms, but it tends where there are hierarchies for those hierarchies to be ephemeral or transcendable. Now, why bother if this is a residual mode of production? I think it persists because people reproduce it without knowing what it is, but they reproduce it because the relationships are sustaining. And I'm not talking about sort of blood relations or that form of family that is so bracketed by ideological and patriarchal ideologies, but the circuits of sharing, pooling resources, caregiving, which may be done resentfully, I don't care, as long as it's done, right? And, it's like, here, take your medicine. Right, and it's like, and it doesn't have to be angels doing this. People can be very resentful, but the point is, it's a circuit where sharing and caregiving and pooling of resources, to the extent that people control any resources, is done without calculation. It's not done in anticipation of an inheritance. It's done because the person is the person. They need help. You do it. You can help. You do help. And I think it's in that sense where the things that you give are use values. The things you receive are use values. The relationships that you express in this kind of kinship are non-hierarchical, or they're age hierarchical. You don't ask a kid, what have you done for me in the last 5 minutes when they're hungry? I mean, well, maybe you do, but you're a jerk if you do. Okay, so part of this is, yeah, right. You do that to adolescents, but so far from an extinct or characteristic of resilient but threatened indigenous groups around the world, and this is true, I mean, you can also see it operating there, I would argue that the shadow of primitive communism, stripped of the group's control over resources, provides the only sustained security that workers in the capitalist world have in that world that has shrinking safety nets. It gets reinvented without people knowing what it is. And so they can the scholars can retain the dismissal of the notion of primitive communism, but their kid is going to move back home when the times are tough, okay? And hopefully they won't say, what have you done for me in the last 10 minutes? Okay, so I'm not arguing this probably alone, maybe, but I know there are a lot of Marxist anthropologists that would disagree with me, but I think Richard Lee and Eleanor Leacock in the planet that she's on now, and Stanley Diamond, who's sort of floating around the upper part of this room right now, that they would probably agree. And I think that what you need in order to detect these things is a feminist approach. And I'm not one of those idiots that think that men can't be feminists. Hello, it doesn't reside in the gonads. As Carly Fiorina's testimony. So by that I mean you start with the mundane, the ignored, the devalued, the throwaway, the people who are seen as insignificant. And you examine the ways that certain objects that they use, that they make, come to materialize relationships beyond notions of the gift or what Tausig would probably consider a commodity fetish. Okay? I really disagree with Tausig a lot around this stuff. Okay? I think he doesn't understand kinship very well. And seeing his life, I'm right. But in examining forms of use values, we can come to appreciate the entrenched rejection of capitalist relationships to varying degrees among the kinds of connections that break down foregone communities, the received communities, the communities that are carved out by the normal operation of capitalism into divisive, competitive groups of various sorts, by race, by gender, by class, and, well, class, there's a reason for it to be divisive, and all the vectors, religion, nationality, immigration status, all of those factors that are used to distract people from the normal operation of capitalism, which is accumulation and the exploitation of people's labor for private profit. It's very effective. It's not a conspiracy. It's the normal operation of that mode of production. That's what it does. It creates a division of labor that creates divisions among people. But the crises in capitalism is where you can see the moments when people try to reproduce this other way of being. And the deeper the crisis, the more you can see both the frustrated anger, racist outbreaks like the trumpet people, or you can see things like Black Lives Matter and the organization of people across ethno-nationalist lines to say, the Syrians should come here, as the people of Flint said. The mayor of Flint said, I would welcome the people, the Syrian refugees here. It's shared fate, it's shared condition, and it flies in the face of the hatred and the fear-mongering and all the rest of that, which are part and parcel of capitalist reproduction. So in examining a few forms of use value, people don't look at what constitutes use value very much. It's kind of a residual category in the Marxist lexicon, because the real stuff is exchange value, right? And I think that privileges capitalism too much. I'm not willing to give capitalism that space. It's like, fuck you, capitalism. And Stanley heard that, and so did I. My Lenten vow was to get rid of my potty mouth. So that's another duck for Heifer International. Okay. I'm buying ducks for Heifer International. I probably will have to buy an ark by the time for Easter rolls around. We need to figure out, by looking at use values, another way of looking at our everyday lives and the possibilities of emancipatory practice, even in the belly of the beast. Okay? This section I call the Velveteen Rabbit, Sadie Koala, and the Naga. Okay. Okay. It was a private joke. It won't be. Okay. The Velveteen, I begin with the devalued, the heavily gendered, the mundane, the work of reproduction that capitalism does not sustain, but that people do. Okay? And therefore, it is heavily gender marked. And so where better than to start with the least valued people in this kind of society, which are children of the working class. Okay? And in kin formation that is not the ideology of blood being thicker than water, but people need families to turn out okay, and you make your families where you find them. And so we're not talking about those deracinated families that are so framed by capitalist and patriarchal relations as to be dangerous to their own less authoritative members. That's not the families we're talking about, where the violence of capitalism is replicated on a local level. Instead, I'm looking at kinship as a process of caregiving, security, such as we can provide, pooling of resources, such as we control, and arenas of generalized reciprocity. That demarcates another sense of family that is more acceptable, if you will, to anthropological practice than the kind of sociology of the family stuff. In The Velveteen Rabbit, which is a book written by Marjorie Williams and first published in 1922, it's still in print. So much for our academic books. Okay. It's like, okay. So, you can't sustain arrogance if you look at this. Really. In The Velveteen Rabbit, a child receives a purchased toy as a gift. Over the years, the rabbit's velveteen is rubbed bare by hugs and play. An ear is loppy, the parts are torn, and eventually its materiality becomes compromised. It is, in the eyes of the commodity world, worthless. You couldn't sell it on eBay. But magically, it becomes a real rabbit. Its rabbitness created by the bond between the child's experiences, and the toy. It is in print today in part because it embodies an animism in an alienated capitalist society that is most clearly seen in children's relationships with objects. However, don't think you're escaping this, adults. Animism is alive and well and living in everyday life. Okay? Who has not threatened their computer? Who has not promised their car a lube job if they start just this once? Okay? No. Animism is deeply part of us. And it is an unwise person who thinks that they've transcended it. All they have to do is stub their toe on a wrought iron table. Okay? Cursing a table. Yeah, right. Who says it doesn't have a way of being? And it doesn't like you. Okay. Sadie Koala is a stuffed animal that Tom Patterson gave to my daughter the first time they met, okay? Sarah took Sadie everywhere. She slept with Sadie. She dressed Sadie in clothes that she took from dolls that went around in their underwear as a result. Sadie went with us around the world, pretty much, collecting relatives and forming ties with people in our lives who sustain us to this day, who share their complex histories with us, who are safe and loving and gentle warriors for social justice. Sadie became a, quote, good voice when, quote, the bad voices, unquote, of those who had hurt her so deeply threatened her emerging sense of self. 25 years later, Sadie is gray and balding, a bit saggy, like all of us. And would be utterly worthless on eBay. Okay. But she sits in plain view in Sarah's closet, greeted daily, carefully put out of reach of our marauding puppies. Okay. The third example I want to give you is the Naga. Okay. The Naga, in its exchange value, would be a custom plastic and epoxy clay fantasy creation. Yeah. Its materials are all commodified, from the celluloid acetate base body to the Krylon spray fixative. Its shape, sometimes we can turn pages, emerged over time from the imaginings, I guess in my brain, fostered by Tom Patterson's waggish history of Utica, with its polenta fields and grazing Naga herds from which Naga hide is derived. Okay. To hear Tom describe Utica is to be transported by the enchantment of a fine ethnographer. He delights us, he makes us laugh, he invites repartee, he draws us into the age-old kin-binding of storytelling. The Naga is a gift and an embodiment of appreciation, of the camaraderie of siblings. The Naga is not a totem. It is an embodiment of sharing and caring and shared fate and common struggle and love. Now we turn to the more analytical part, so go to sleep. Okay. Primitive communism as a mode of production and reproduction, and that's the feminist moment, folks. It's not this orthodox Marxism where reproduction is only social reproduction and excludes any kind of relationship to kin formation. The mode of production and reproduction is a process of what some have called kin communal societies in order to avoid primitive communists, right? Kin ordered societies, which isn't very descriptive, non-state societies, which is kind of a null category, and so on, okay? The problematic term primitive was used to indicate time depth, not lack of complexity. Most of human history, after all, was spent in such societies, disparate and differentiated. They weren't all the same, as production and reproduction involving use values instead of exchange values can entail. The marketplaces of ancient states were not markets, for they were comprised of an exchange of use values, but it was driven by tribute-driven, they were comprised by tribute-driven redistribution systems, except where people subverted them by the roadside, away from the eyes of the state, and so on. All you have to do, and I hope you have the opportunity to do this, is to visit the National Museum in Cairo. Go to one of the 3 rooms full of grave sculptures of production processes that were buried with upper-class ancient Egyptian administrators, mostly royal. And in those sculptures, it's always some kind of production process that's related to tribute. And in every one, it shows either men or women busily at work, making something, looking very diligent, And in every one of them, there is an overseer somewhere in the sculpture. Okay? It's tribute, folks. It's not a surplus that they're extracting. It's people's work that they're extracting, okay? It may be a surplus to the state, but it's certainly not a surplus to the people whose goods and services are being ripped off, okay? So in these tribute-based states and slave-based states, both of them relied on these kin communities for much of the reproductive labor, all of the goods and services that supported the dominant class or classes. They weren't powerful enough to dissolve them. Capitalism isn't strong enough to dissolve them. They can't pay for reproductive labor to that extent. They can't control people to that extent. And so wherever you see this, even if it is in distorted form, because people no longer control all their resources, right? But even if it is in a distorted form, you still see these things. Who has not gone outside? Well, maybe if you live in a gated community, but who in a real community hasn't gone outside on Saturday morning and seen guys exchanging work on the car? Okay? I'll do this, you provide the beer and pizza. Okay, right? That this is something which is the exchange of use values. It is not an exchange value. It is beyond capitalism. It subverts capitalism. After all, it's not contributing to the businesses that do this. So that although it is not consciously anti-hegemonic in the Gramscian sense, it is counter-hegemonic, right? It isn't in keeping with the hegemony that says that market relations are the best thing since sliced bread. And by the way, sliced bread will cost you 5 cents more. But yet, tribute-based states relied on primitive communism. Capitalism relies on primitive communism, and so on. So why would we be so vehemently pro-capitalist as to imbue capitalism with the power to eliminate this mode of production? Why would we call the people who are trying to identify these sources of solidarity beyond reified forms like the family, but kinship, right? Kinship that is not, a kind of received form of family. Why would we want to give that power away? Okay? Why would we want to deny a source of solidarity? And I think that sympathy for the state on the one hand and the sympathy for capitalism is trained, but people on some levels will echo it, they'll speak it. Well, this is the best system we have. It may not be perfect, but it's the best system we've got. And the answer is, who's we? And so instead of thinking of this as an arcane category or an historical oddity or a placeholder when the real focus is capitalism, and why do we assume that the colonialism, post-colonial transformative triumph is complete and utter and, going to survive at least until the world disintegrates from global warming? What I want to suggest is that if we examine capitalism from this kind of based in everyday life, living with use values, that if we look at the kind of poetic language of children and the animism that we all have, okay, that tell us that we, on some levels, live in relationship to a world, that the world is not alienated from us because the world is alive, because the world is part of us, because the four-footeds are our little companions, right? Because the four-footeds they're not babies, they have their own consciousness, and we can't delve into it, we can appreciate it. Okay? We don't have to turn bonobos into proto-humans. We can appreciate bonobos' extravagant sexuality for what it is. It's bonobo-ness, okay? The best thing at the San Diego Zoo. But So if we look at this, and the kind of, from a positive sense, we can see some of these things. In a negative sense, we can see the points of articulation with capitalism as points where tension and violence are endemic in the received communities. Okay? The received community, not the communities of solidarity that people are forming, always are trying to form, but the ones that are received. The family, not a good place to be if you're a woman. You can get pretty roughed up there. But families you create, safe families, this is a nice thing to do, right? And the same thing with the violence of, within racialized communities. Those are setups by capitalism. But if you look at the movements against those that are not sort of more police, right? If you look at the other movements against it that are the woman-centered movements, because after all, whose labor is less valued, whose work is less valued, the people who have to have dealt with being undervalued and dismissed and marginalized for a very long period of time, then we can learn how solidarity really works. And so I think that, I don't know where to take this at this point, but I think that what we can do is to educate ourselves to look more carefully and to appreciate those little moments of connection that exist, the opportunities of solidarity making by listening, by hearing common history, by hearing common condition, by rejecting the received analysis that capitalism will give you. It's them. And to pay attention to that, not as a romantic notion, but as actually a kind of guiding light for transforming this monstrous place that we live in. And in closing, I want to quote from Chief Joseph, who's one of my favorite people. Almost got to Canada. Jeez, I'm really sympathetic with Chief Joseph. We may all almost get to Canada at some point. And he said toward the end of his life, "Live lightly on the land. Life is the breath of a buffalo in winter. We have the breath, so let us breathe." Okay, thank you. Somebody wants to ask, if you had a superpower, what would it be? Okay? And I thought, I don't know, fixing my chromosomes would be nice. But I thought my superpower is shooting acid from my mouth. Okay? Any questions? Yes, Sarah. Yes.
But how are those youth values created with relationships that we have just by association with the context that we're thrown into from our work, right? Maybe that's something that we choose and we're put into context with those people, but how do you see that developing and
what I see happening here in part, okay, now it's not going to be everybody and all the rest of it, but in everybody who basically intervenes in a homophobic comment, that's saying, I connect with you. I stand with you. I think every time that a teacher rejects the model of being the taskmaster in favor of a more nurturing and inclusive pedagogy, I think that marks it. I think it's feeling like we're all in this struggle together, and that this is an incredible sort of stand against corporate education that we're making happen despite the structure of the university. Now, we are really unusual. We're really working hard. Look around. I mean, solidarity, yeah. And I think the more that people understand that, our use values are the knowledge that we're producing together, and the places that we share it, and the education that we will share with the world if they want to hear. To me. Okay. Oh, great. I'm glad I answered all of your questions. Forever. Thank you.